This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Huey Hewitt, a late-stage doctoral student in the Department of African American Studies at Harvard University. Hewitt is a graduate of the Department of Black Studies at Amherst College, in which he wrote a lengthy thesis on Black trans incarceration, which was awarded highest honors. At Harvard, Hewitt has continued to interrogate the intersections of race, class, and gender identity in the context of mass incarceration and the police state, and is currently composing a doctoral dissertation on key figures in the Black anarchist tradition. In this conversation, we explore the relation of Hewitt's interests and research to the past of Black studies and what that research might mean for creating and sustaining new horizons in the field. Hello, Huey. Good to see you. How are you doing?
Good to see you, John. How are you?
I'm great. I'm extremely happy that we found time to talk today. You and I go way back, working together for a number of years, and now you're dissertating at Harvard University in the Department of African American Studies. And I'm really interested to hear about your experience in the field, your thoughts on the field, and your current research. So I really appreciate you making the time to talk, because I know we're all busy, but once you hit that dissertation stage, it's hard to make time for much. So,
absolutely, I'm happy to. Thank you for inviting me.
So I wanted to start, before I sort of ask you some questions on your thoughts on the field of Black studies, both its past, present, and future. I just wanted to ask you to narrate a little bit your intellectual journey. What is it about the study of Black life that drew you into the field of Black studies, but also what is it about the study of Black life that sustains your energy? Because whether we're teaching and writing or working in graduate school and writing dissertations, we have to have something that sustains that work, that makes that energy possible. So I always like to hear both, like, sort of narration, like how do these questions come to you? How did you get interested in what sustains you as a scholar and person around these questions of Black life?
So I guess I'll answer that question in two registers, one a bit more general and one that's more specific to the topics I'm interested in. So more generally, I guess I'll say, like a lot of scholars, like a lot of PhDs, I've always been a little bit of a nerd, really into school, but I found that there was always something missing for me through high school and well into my first year of college, until I discovered Black studies. And then it was almost like a light turned on, or a fire got started. And then I found myself actually interested and actually engaged with, actually almost thirsty for what I was reading and writing and thinking about. And I think a part of what that is a symptom of is, frankly, just kind of hegemonic discourses, hegemonic ideologies outside of Black studies, almost forcing us to dissociate away from things that I think most people find actually intellectually interesting. The common narratives that we're taught about slavery, about the civil rights movement, that we're taught about in our history classes in high school, or in a lot of history classes in high school, right? Don't exactly get to the fundamental human questions that I think are at stake in Black studies, or don't approach these histories from the perspective that almost seems that is unique to Black studies in a lot of ways, but actually should be common sense for most human beings, Yeah. And I think that's what sustains my interest in Black studies as a field generally, is really kind of getting to dive right into the most important human questions without distracting flow. And then in terms of topics, as you know, at Amherst College, I studied the incarceration of Black trans people. So I was really interested in Black trans studies, Black queer studies. I still am. I still read in those fields. I still maintain relationships with colleagues in those fields. But at the doctoral level, I've also gotten more interested in political theory proper. And I'm writing a dissertation on the history of Black anarchism in the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, some people might see that as kind of an intellectual departure, as really kind of a strong left turn or turn anywhere, however you might want to articulate it. For me, it's actually a lot of continuity. You know, when I was thinking through questions around Black queer life, Black trans life during my undergraduate studies, I was doing so from an anarchist lens, frankly, or at least from a lens which took seriously the Black radical tradition. And I think, you know, like a lot of people, I think that tradition can offer us a lot of ways to answer a wide range of questions, from slavery to the incarceration of Black trans folks. And so in a lot of ways, I'm actually still studying what I was studying in undergrad, just from a different vantage point.
That's fantastic. I mean, you know, you never know what happens between undergraduate and graduate school. I love that sense of continuity, but also that shift. And I do think, I mean, I want to talk to you about this, you know, in more specific detail and, you know, a little bit later, but I think that approach of the approach to thinking about the issues you're interested in from the Black anarchist frame, right? And you said, and the Black radical tradition. I think there's a lot of Black radical tradition framings in a lot of scholarship, but it's really that Black anarchism that is such an enigma, in the sense of, you know, I think it gets evoked periodically, but it's really not something that people talk about, you know. And I remember when you were an undergraduate and reading your work and talking about it with colleagues, your senior thesis, which I have to say, and I know I'm partisan, but this is actually nonpartisan, the best senior thesis I've ever read. Is absolutely fantastic. But part of what was confounding, I think, for a lot of folks, I mean, you and I had talked so much, I knew where you were coming from, is that anarchist framing it doesn't have those habits of thought. So, you know, the diving deep into human questions, and then the way we frame those human questions in a Black studies context is one thing, but that Black anarchism just opens up this whole new horizon. And I was curious to hear you talk about that also, of how that sustains you. I don't want to say you're alone in that field of research, but you're blazing a lot of first trails there.
Yeah, I mean, you know, obviously I feel really grateful to the people in Black studies who have at least given a nod to Black anarchism, even if they're not writing about it in depth. But yeah, you know, not a lot of people have written about it, especially from a kind of a grounded historical perspective. Yeah. And I think I will say that even though in some ways I might feel a little bit alone writing about Black anarchism, I do feel like there's a lot of thirst for knowledge amongst both Black studies scholars and Black studies students for information about Black anarchism. So that grounds me.
Yeah, and I think the best clue that a book needs to be written is some people nod at something without ever fully exploring. It's always a good clue. So, you know, you talk about your interest in political theory broadly in the Black studies tradition, or the Black radical tradition. You know, that actually speaks to something about the origins of the field. You know, I think at this point is common knowledge, at least among Black studies scholars and students, that the field has its origins in student activism on campuses and agitation, obviously assisted some with professors and so forth, but it really was a political moment of demanding presence and representation and place on these predominantly white campuses that had near exclusively white curricula and departments. And that was a very political move, of course, but part of what it also helped birth was this, what now is a commonplace phrase, the Black intellectual tradition, that this is something that existed and needed at the origins of Black studies to be both articulated and supported institutionally and in terms of intellectual life. And so for me, it's interesting to think about where we are now, but also just think about where we've come from in the field, this crossroads between political urgency and the way that's disruptive of institutions, in this case, universities, but also intellectual traditions, which are about, culture, art, literature, music, and so forth. And so I'm curious for you how you think about the relationship between, say, the political impact of Black studies as a field and the development of an intellectual tradition. They have a relationship, but they're also very different projects. I wonder how you think about the origins of the field and sort of negotiate that relationship.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question because I can't help but think about present day political conditions when I think about this question. I think when I talk to colleagues at a similar level as mine, fellow graduate students, I think sometimes we get this sense that some older scholars in Black studies partially abandoned, frankly, kind of the community instinct of the field in its early days.
Yeah.
And I think that the consequence of that was a partial retraction from community activism and just community sensibility for maybe part of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s in Black studies. And I think that I understand that maybe a part of that impulse emerged from a desire to be taken seriously by institutions and more fully integrated into institutions. And for lack of a better term, I'm almost safe and secure within institutions.
Yeah.
And I think, again, with when we consider the times we're in and the attacks on higher education we're seeing by far-right politicians and their supporters, I don't think that endeavor of retraction was successful. I don't think that trying to be safely and securely institutionalized without constant outreach for community support and being grounded in community activism actually served the field or served the purpose of protecting the less praxis-oriented, more behind closed doors intellectual engagement with Black life. And so I think in order to protect that intellectual tradition, there has to be this community engagement, just the reality of the world we're living in. I think talking to, again, a lot of people at my stage in their scholarly career, a lot of fellow graduate students and early career scholars, I think that sensibility, the common sensibility, is changing. I think it's more common these days to find someone with a very intensely grounded community orientation than otherwise. And I think that is going to serve the field going forward, because I don't think that that Black studies is going to be secure within the academy in the years to come, especially if fascists get what they want. And so, I'm kind of reminded, this is a bit of an aside, but it's related. I'm kind of reminded a few years ago when I was looking at different graduate schools, and it was late at night, and I had just gotten back to the hotel room with other prospective students after just a full day of looking at a university. And we had all been talking all day about the contradictions of Black studies in the academy. And, I said something like, I just love Black studies. And then I caught myself and I said, but I hate the academy. And I don't know what to do with that. And a dear friend of mine, Desmond, who actually studies right now under Robin Kelley at UCLA, said, don't worry, Black studies isn't the academy. And I think in the years to come, as Black studies comes under fire more, and in some cases I think will become deinstitutionalized at some universities, I think we're going to see the meaning of that, and it's going to be up to scholars and as individuals and in community with one another to make that statement true.
And it's interesting to think about what you're saying, because I think the common sense, even just a few years ago, would have been the way you protect. Now, whether it's worth protecting under these conditions is a whole other question. But the way you would protect something like Black studies is to be less political. So you draw less political attention. But what's so interesting to me is how actually the war on, I don't even know what you want to call it, like the war on difference. And in this case, it's a war on all things that have to do with what touches Black studies, has actually been a war on the very idea of it. It seems to be very much less like, well, there are radical politics and that needs to be squashed and booted out of the academy. That seems to be less the fascist attack than they're just talking about Black life. It's sort of, so when you talk about that sort of staying safe within the academy, there's a kind of irony there. And I think that we have to ask, now I asked you the question, now I'm pontificating, but I think there's this real question of like, you know, if we go down, did we go down with the right ideas, you know, or did we try to stay depoliticized as a field? And then we end up suffering the same fate as if we had been trying to burn down the White House every day as a group of faculty. I love that image, a bunch of faculty trying to burn anything down. But that love of Black studies and not love of the academy is a really interesting phrase. And I think Black studies can save the academy.
Yeah.
But boy, are we ever on the chopping block every day these days. And are we going down as political radicals, or are we going down as we tried to be as safe as possible? The way you put that, I think, was really striking. So I hope people listen to this and think about that. I know I will. I really like the way you phrase that.
Yeah, I hope so too.
So, you know, your own work, as you were talking about it, is so much on contemporary political issues, critical politics, focused initially on incarceration, as you said, developing into a history, maybe a genealogy of Black anarchism. And so I'm interested, thinking about, you know, some of what what you were just talking about in terms of the past of Black studies. I'm really interested in how you think this question of Black anarchism, and maybe you also want to talk, or, you know, maybe don't, but your work on the incarceration of Black trans people, right? How this kind of work that you're doing relates to the past of the field. And I mean that in a couple of ways. Like, how do you see it in terms of what it expands about the past of the field? And what do you think your work is doing as a new horizon? Because not everything has to draw on key elements. Sometimes part of a tradition is a brand new idea that disrupts everything. And so I'm curious how you think about your own work in relation to key elements of the tradition and its founding, but also the new horizons you see it opening up.
So I guess one of the things I'm thinking about with regards both to my project on the incarceration of Black trans folks and my project now on the history of Black anarchism, or really the history of Black anarchists, I think what I'm doing very explicitly in this project, and what I did more implicitly in the previous project, was engage people who are not frequently seen as intellectuals or political thinkers or political actors, and engage them as they are, as intellectuals, as political thinkers and political actors. And I think so much of the history of Black studies for me has been about pushing back on the racist notion that Black people are intellectually inferior and that Black people can't be intellectuals, and really just standing on our own ground and kind of prizing the importance of Black life and Black intellectual life without kind of having to have an external reference point. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, obviously universities have even dismissed the intellectualism of people like Du Bois, who had PhDs, right? Yeah. And so I think in that way, I'm trying to continue the tradition of the field of saying, you know, Black trans people who are incarcerated can be theorists of their own experience, can be theorists of gender and race and incarceration. And in my current project now, a lot of what I'm trying to articulate is that Black anarchism and Black anarchists have been so sidelined, so dismissed, whether dismissed through erasure and omission, or dismissed as extremists in the mainstream press. And a part of why that is because, our society ritualistically refuses to see Black poor people and Black working class people, especially so-called criminals, as political thinkers or political actors. And so obviously I think that pushes the field in new ways, because we don't have that much literature on Black anarchism, or frankly on Black trans people in Black studies. But again, it's also drawing on that tradition of reminding people to see intellectual life where it already is, but where it has been intentionally dismissed and erased.
I really love that. I think that framing of, what Black studies does so well in the retrieval of what the academy wouldn't see as, so obviously framed that way, what the academy wouldn't see as intellectual resources, and moving them not just as, people or events or expressions that, we are sort of clients of real, quote unquote, real academia or real intellectual work, but rather being intellectual work itself. Continuing that is, I think, just so important, given that the field is really developed. It has a canon, it has its intellectuals, it has its set of references that you sort of figure you have to give. If you're going to talk about alienation, you have to talk about Du Bois, right? But what would it mean, as you're saying, to keep that other part alive of intellectuals are everywhere, right? And extending that, but also extending that as an origin of the tradition, right? Because in the end, the field was invented by undergraduate students. I think about that all the time. I'm like, we get irritated with students when they don't turn something in or they don't cite correctly or whatever, but I'm like, they're capable because they invented this field. But also to remember that, that was a part of them that were intellectuals, that understood that everyday people had something to say, and not just the PhDs, but even the PhDs haven't had a chance to say, as you said, Du Bois. We spent all that time in Amherst. They had to keep Du Bois's papers in the basement for years because he was a communist. Now everything is named Du Bois at UMass, now that he's been retrieved. But the recency of all of these things moving to be taken seriously intellectually, I think can change our vision of what's going on. I'm really happy to hear you say that. I will say, as a pre-plug for anyone who's listening, Michael Sawyer and I are starting a short book series on global Black critical thought, and it's going to focus on non-conventional intellectuals as intellectuals. So not only do I agree with you on that, and I'm excited by your work on that, but we're going to try to institutionalize it for better or worse with some written stuff. So let me ask you about, talking about the origins of the field and your how you think of your own work fitting in there. I'm also curious about how your experience as an undergraduate and now a doctoral student in Black Studies departments relates to your own work with or relationship to disciplines and disciplinary approaches. I know you're also a history major in college, so disciplines aren't unfamiliar to you. But I'm wondering how you think about the field of Black Studies and the methodologies and approaches to research that come out of the field, how that impacts and continues to have an impact on the kind of work you do, and how you think about that also in relation to disciplines, So broadly, really about the question, I guess, about disciplines and multidisciplinarity, but also more specifically, Black Studies does have methodologies in it. It's not just a collection of disciplines. It also has its own approaches, which you are so deeply schooled in. But also, you said a history of Black anarchists, and you made that distinction, not a history of Black anarchism, but Black anarchists. Those are distinctions that are so important for disciplines, but also for Black Studies, which is a different set of methods. So I'm curious, in your own research, as a way in, but also how you think about that relationship between Black studies and its approaches and disciplines. What does it set free in your writerly and thinkerly voice? And what do disciplines still offer you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is such a big question, and I find myself both getting the sense of, I have so many thoughts on this, and feeling a little bit of the smooth brain sense of I have no answers that will be adequate here. So these are just some kind of haphazard thoughts and reflections, not exhaustive. I mean, I guess I'll say, just because of the concrete material history of universities and concomitantly of disciplines, there are ways in which traditional disciplines still think very conservatively, and therefore sometimes do not offer us the tools we need to study something like Black life. Mm-hmm. At least not when we're using kind of the traditional methods and methodologies of traditional disciplines. And so take something like oral history, for example, right? Obviously, oral history has now become more kind of integrated into mainstream history. It's taken more seriously. But there are still, some historians who claim that oral histories, even with people coming out of societies where there is a strong oral tradition, are unreliable source material, or are even useless source material. Mm-hmm. And obviously we know that that's not true. And then also, when we're talking about oral histories with people who might not be coming out of a strong oral tradition and who might be getting some of the facts wrong, this notion that there might not also be other important or significant aspects of the oral history, other things besides just raw facts, or like what dates something took place. Yeah. The notion that isn't important, I mean, it just dismisses so many dimensions of a human experience that, to me, ought to be central to how we do any kind of history, not just African American history. And so in that sense, I think Black studies has the capacity to definitely elevate my own thinking as a historian. And I think elevate the thinking of a lot of people working out of and within traditional disciplines. And then, at least for me, I can only really offer a somewhat personal answer as to how disciplinary thinking helps me as a Black studies scholar. Mm-hmm. And that's just to say, being grounded in something like history, or being grounded in almost kind of a particular set of methods, really just helps me to organize my thinking without going on too many tangents, or kind of pulling in too many things that might not actually ground the reader in the realities of what I'm saying, right? Because there are a lot of ways to talk about Black anarchism, but not a lot of people have done it from a historical perspective. And so I think actually just giving the reader a little bit more bone and meat, sometimes I think it helps to do that from a disciplinary perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting that I really love what you were saying about how disciplines, gatekeep the processing of information. That's a kind of bland way to put it, but that example of oral history and its reliability or unreliability, and the way that becomes, for certain disciplines, a kind of binary. It's either it's helpful or it's unhelpful, rather than, well, what about a more literary approach, right? What about thinking about this in relation to expressive culture rather than, recounting of facts, but also the way that multiplicity of approaches can be, it's hard to write in a Black Studies register. And I had this kind of, when you were talking, I had this kind of thought of, my disciplinary background is in philosophy, and often philosophers have told me, well, it seems like it's so much easier for you to write because you're not sort of bound by this sort of really strict kind of vocabulary or framing of philosophy. It must be easier. And I always want to say, no, it's like, actually philosophy makes it easier by saving me periodically, as you said, from all of those multiple tangents, because the multiple approaches, they open up the richness of Black life in these incredible ways that it ought to be opened up. But also, as you said, it's hard to write with all of those perspectives. You know, I don't want to be too biblical about it, but the Tower of Babel was like a problem for a reason. You know, it's like when we start to see all these different ways of approaching a voice, we need that moment of regulation. Do you feel comfortable thinking of your research as historical research, or do you really think that the Black Studies methodology defies that kind of categorization? Because you use the word history.
Yeah, I'm thinking through your question. You know, I guess there's to borrow a term from you, there's kind of a philosophical appeal for me of thinking about the project as a Black Studies project. But then there's kind of a utilitarian side of me that is frequently when I talk to people about Black anarchism. Their questions are, what are you even talking about? What even is that? I've never heard of this. And even just if you just try to explain to someone what Black anarchism might be abstractly, conceptually, theoretically, at the level of political philosophy, still I find people are confused. And so, at least for me, labeling this project as a historical project, kind of operating as a historian, even maybe as an interdisciplinary historian, to bring in other things that are meaningful to me and that I think might also be meaningful to the reader. I think doing that is kind of a way of creating a window into, in this case specifically, Black anarchist thinking that clarifies things for certain readers.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. So let me, since this is all about big speculative questions, and you've in some ways addressed this, and we're sort of touching on it, I think, there a bit. But a big speculative question is sort of thinking back about the past of Black studies. Like, what do you think that the field in its history has done particularly well, and what do you think it hasn't done particularly well? Or you may say done really poorly or completely erased or neglected. So when I say it's not done particularly well, I want to open up the range of, all fields' presence and absence, things that they research.
I think I'll say that the extent to which the field has remained community-oriented, I think that's the extent to which the field has been doing something well. I think that the field has honestly done wonders for gender theory. I think that any thinking about gender coming out of Black studies as early as the 70s, well into now, has offered us just a lot of really rich ways to think about gender as a dimension of human experience. And then I guess relatedly, I think Black studies has done a really good job thinking through intersections and contradictions. In this case, I'm thinking especially about Dr. Evelyn Higginbotham's work on race, sex, gender, and class, and the ways in which those forces intersected in the Jim Crow South. So, gender, what we might call intersectionality, or the intersections and contradictions of experience. And I think at this stage now, I find that what the field is doing best is keeping people, not just Black studies scholars and not just Black studies students, but people intellectually engaged. I mean, I know people who don't even have their associate's degree yet, who are buying books on Duke University Press, the Duke University Press website about Black life, and I don't think that that's, I don't think that those experiences are outliers. So I think keeping people intellectually engaged is also a strength of the field right now.
What do you think it has not done particularly well?
Kind of similar to what I was saying at the at the beginning of our conversation, I think that the extent to which people have retracted from being community oriented has been a primary weakness for the field. And I think we're going to see in the years to come what the consequences of that might be as we face more and more political repression.
Yeah. I can't believe we're at this crossroads, but we are. Yeah. So I want to ask you this. This is another one of these. I mean, this is the nature of this podcast series, the big questions about Black studies, but another big question about Black studies. I'm often struck by two ways to think about the purpose of the field in the world of higher education, the world of ideas, right? So the founding of Black studies, as we've talked about, and you talked about quite extensively, has this deeply political and community dimension. Also has this founding of but the institutionalization of the Black intellectual tradition, and its ability to reproduce itself through systems of knowledge transmission and all of that. And one of the ways to think about that is that, well, the study of Black life and the way Black people have made sense of their lives diasporically, in different locales, has its own methodologies that need to be articulated and honored on their own right. And on that model, something like the founding of Black studies is to found this kind of, specific, peculiar, particular methodology. It shifts and changes, but as something fundamentally different. And so Black studies is something that has to go on, right? Because it is, like history, a particular discipline with a method. The other is to say, well, part of establishing something like an intellectual tradition is to say, look, instead of being the only person in the entire humanities who works on Black literature, right, have a Black studies department where, you develop richly with other colleagues this extensive sense of what, African-American literature is, Caribbean literature is, just to take two examples. But that the ultimate goal of all of this is to so establish Caribbean African-American literature, Black history, Black philosophy, that in the end, the purpose of Black studies is to dissolve itself, to no longer need itself, so that philosophy is no longer this bastion of white supremacist thought that thinks only European thinkers are important, but now is the world, right? Or the world of Black life, integral to the discipline. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on that difference, right? The difference between like Black studies as something that goes on forever because it has, for the foreseeable future, because it has its own methodologies, or is it really best understood as something that will eventually argue for its own dissolution because it becomes so deeply transformative of disciplines themselves?
Mm-hmm. I guess this question feels somewhat difficult to think my way through, in part because we're so far away from any world in which an argument for the dissolution of Black studies is tenable.
Yeah.
Meaning, right, this kind of Black studies being a particularism that is actually about universalism, right, or kind of a truer universalism. I won't say that's an argument I'm unsympathetic to. And I do think that Black studies has the capacity to transform how we think philosophically, how we think historically, how we think about sociology, how we think even scientifically. And I think we're so far from that promised land, which, right, is not just an intellectual promised land or an academic promised land, but I think would require a lot of changes in our political, economic, and social lives that, to me, it's almost a question that is not yet relevant. And I think that at the point that it becomes more relevant, hopefully sooner rather than later, then I think people can only really respond to the conditions and circumstances they find themselves in. And I almost don't want to prescribe that, say we're living in a much more egalitarian society, no more police, no more prisons, so on and so forth. I think people can decide at that point, well, maybe we should maintain Black studies as kind of almost like a historical monument to what was. Maybe they won't make that decision, but I definitely think it's something that people will have to decide when the conditions are more right for that kind of decision.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny when you say that sort of this different kind of vision of a universalism. You know, it really struck a chord with me because one of the ways, you know, one of the things that was in my mind in asking this question and posing this question to people we talk to is, you know, what Fanon and Césaire said about the purpose of decolonization, the purpose of revolution, the purpose of a post-colonial vision was what Discourse on Colonialism calls a humanism made to the measure of the world. But there's also this counter tradition of with somebody like James Baldwin or Edouard Glissant, who were more obsessed with and more committed to the particularities of, for Baldwin, that African Americans are their own people, that Caribbeanness is a thing that can't be broadened and universalized. And yeah, I think it's one of these quiet debates inside Black studies, which is more deep about ontology, about epistemology and so forth. But, you know, I always come back to, you know, how long are we supposed to be Black studies? I mean, it's going to be my lifetime. It's going to be your lifetime, I think, unless there's some positive apocalypse coming, which I see no indication of, to put it lightly. But I like that, that it has to be shaped later, this question. I mean, essentially, that's what Fanon said about new humanism is we can't actually say what it is because we have to be there to say. So final question, and it's actually sort of in some ways, a twist on these last two. Whatever happens that way about, you know, Black studies as its own thing in perpetuity or dissolving itself, you know, what questions in terms of the future of the field, because we've talked about the present and the past, but thinking about the future of the field, if someone were to say to you, and someone should say to you, right? I think people writing dissertations in a field, they ought to have a sort of first chance at the mic on these kinds of questions. What do you think are the most urgent questions that you want us all to be asking? Maybe a question or a cluster of questions. Or do you think there's not a question we should be asking?
Well, again, I can't help but think about the moment we're in. I guess one of the questions inevitably has to be, how does Black studies survive this moment and the historical period to come? Whether that survival, when I say survival, I don't just mean within the academy, but I don't mean merely without it either. So that's one question I think the field has to be asking itself, or Black studies scholars have to really be asking ourselves. What does it mean to be accountable to community? I think a lot about a really short essay by Mumia Abu-Jamal called Intellectuals and the Gallows. I remember reading it my first year of graduate school when I was really in my head about what it meant to be a Black studies intellectual accountable to Black people and not just Black people within the academy. You know, accountable to, you and I have talked about my great-grandmother, probably given her level of education, she couldn't read much of my scholarship, right? At least not without a struggle. And so I was really in my head running these circles of feeling quite anxious about what it meant to be doing the work I was doing. And again, his essay is only 3 to 4 pages, and his answer is really simple. Do the work, do it well, do it with the interest of the public and the community in mind, and stay connected to community and to life. Stay connected to community. And so I think, you know, there are more particular questions in terms of, you know, how might we think about gender? How might we think about class? How might we think about print culture, and all these really specific kind of intellectual questions? But the big overarching question to me remains, especially in this moment of fascism and political repression, how do we survive and how do we remain accountable to our people.
And how do you think that staying connected, I mean, there are a few different ways of thinking about it, and maybe it just means all at once, but staying connected to communities can mean documentation, right? But Black life is deeply understudied. And so documentation of Black life and the intellectual work that goes on inside everyday expressive culture, you know, however we want to characterize it. So documentation. The other is part of, it seems animating a lot of what you're saying, defense.
Yeah.
Black studies being a defense of Black people and Black communities. But there's also, you know, you also sort of, when you said, you know, questions of gender, you know, it's also those things, those questions can be antagonistic towards the community. So there's also a way that, you know, you can be documentary, you can be defense oriented, and you can also be agitating. And I want to say agitating, right, rather than disrupting in a positive sense, right? I mean, one would think in a positive sense of asking questions that aren't comfortable in those in a given community or sort of broadly. So, yeah, how do you think about that connection to the community in relation to those three or any other in between or on either side?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess this question of agitation or contradiction, I guess for me is central. I think for me, something I try to do as a writer and thinker, also a reader, is where the contradictions are, face them head on as much as possible. Because I think, at least for me, I don't know how other people feel or think, but there's a part of me that sometimes wants to run away from the contradiction or kind of just slip it down under, not have to face it, because it can sometimes be so big. And I think actually the contradictions, that's where everything is. And so where there are contradictions between, working as well as we can, as diligently as we can, as community-oriented Black studies scholars, I think face those contradictions as much as possible, embrace them, and make them actually the center of the work.
I love that. The fantastic characterization. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been incredibly interesting. Anybody who listens to this is going to have a lot to think about. I will. You know, it's been a while since we talked ideas. We periodically talk life, but it's really great to talk ideas and hear these thoughts, which are thoughts, but also in the very best way, I think really provocative challenges to me and to anybody. And it sounds like even for you, you know, you're asking questions to challenge yourself on this. And I really appreciate that. I love your work. I appreciate it so much. We're really lucky to have you in the field. So get back on that dissertation when we get off this call.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me through this and for doing this project in general. I'm really excited about it.
Good to have you on board. All right. Well, thanks a lot. It's good to see you, and take care of yourself.
You too. Peace.